Continuing on in Luke chapter 17. This week we'll be beginning in verse 11. Luke 17, beginning in verse 11, reading down to verse 19. On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee, and as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers, who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. When he saw them, he said to them, Go and show yourselves to the priests. As they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice, and he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? And he said to him, Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well. God bless your word to us this morning. Well, like last week, we have another passage that has similar stories throughout the New Testament. And as I read this story, I got a little bit curious about just the geography and the area that had to do with this. And so as I was thinking about the context of this passage, I tried to figure out where it was. Now, if you look in the maps in the back of your Bible, if you have them, my Bible has a map that shows the regions in and around Israel at Jesus' time, and it also has the roads that were primarily used for travel in that time period. And what I found was interesting was that if you look at the north end of Samaria, and so the nation of Israel is, I should have brought a map, the nation of Israel, basically Galilee, where Jesus is from, is up top, and then you've got Samaria, and then the southern kingdom where Jerusalem is lower. And so the fastest way to get to Jerusalem from the upper section where Galilee was to go through Samaria. Now, most people didn't do that, and for the reason of that they hated the Samaritans. Now, the Samaritans had come out of Judaism, but they only kept part of the Old Testament. They changed parts, and they had a completely different religion. And so most Jews would rather take the trip around, which would add days onto their journey. It's something that we've talked about a couple times, and you've probably heard different preachers talk about when we're talking about the Good Samaritan or the Samaritan woman or all of these different things. There's a part in the New Testament where Jesus is questioned about how much time he spends there. But what's interesting is, at least in my Bible, in verse 11, it says he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. And I was wondering what that was supposed to mean. And if you look at all of the different translations, they say a lot of different things. But most of them center around this idea that he was between the two. And I thought, well, that's kind of precise. I mean, most places there isn't really a between. There's one and the other. But then I looked at my map and I noticed that as you come out of Galilee, there is a road that for a decent stretch follows the Samaritan and Galilean border exactly. And so I wouldn't say all or even most scholars, but at least a good helping of scholars, and I would group myself with them, believe that that's where Jesus was here. It seems to fit. And so I'm operating under the assumption that Jesus was on this road kind of in both places at once. It was a way that people from Samaria and from Galilee could travel without being on one another's turf. It was easier to build one road. That's probably how it came about. And so I'm picturing Jesus here walking along this road that's right on the border of these two nations. Now the Samaritans and the rest of the Jews, they were by no means friends. They were not allies. There was no military conflict at this point, which probably had more to do with the Romans not allowing it than anything else. But as far as personal relationships and religion were concerned, these groups were enemies. Jews were not allowed to marry Samaritans or vice versa. There was no intermarriage. And most importantly, they worshipped in completely different places. The Samaritans had a mountain that they worshipped that they claimed was the tallest mountain in the world, and they believed it was where Noah's Ark landed. They believed it's where the first altar was built. They believed that Abraham was involved there, that Moses was involved there. And so they had tabernacles and temples on the top of this mountain and completely rejected the idea of worshiping in the temple in Jerusalem, which is, of course, where the Jews claimed you had to go at least once a year to worship. And so there was this incredible animosity between the two. They believed completely different things. They did not get along. And so Jesus is walking along between these two areas, these two nations. When he comes along this group of lepers, now they, as they were expected to, kept themselves away. You see, leprosy was it described a few different diseases at the time, but they were all skin diseases. They were all terminal, and they were all easily spread. And so people who got leprosy, there just wasn't any hope for them, and people would dismiss them. Your family, if you got leprosy, they would ask you to leave. You would be required to leave your town and either go live in a leper colony or just go live in the wilderness. We're talking about people that were not allowed to worship in either religion. They weren't allowed into the holy places because of the uncleanliness of their disease. And so someone who had had leprosy, especially if they had it for years, this is someone who hadn't had friends, hadn't had family, hadn't been allowed to worship and offer sacrifice for the forgiveness of their sins for years and years and years. And so they would stay away. They would walk around yelling unclean to make sure everyone knew to stay away from them. And they didn't go close to any other person that didn't have leprosy. There weren't really laws protecting them from ramifications if they did so, and they knew better than to come too close to other people. And so these men, when they come up to Jesus, this group of 10 lepers, they don't approach him, but they call out from a distance for his help. They knew that they weren't allowed close to another person, and so they kept away. But there's something else that I noticed about these lepers. It seems, as we read the story, that as far as nationality was concerned, this was a mixed group. And so we know that in one way or the other, we are right on the border of Galilee and Samaria, where we are just steps away from those who are Jews and steps away from those who are Samaritans. And it would appear, based on what Jesus says in the story, that the group was mixed. Clearly, the man who returns is a Samaritan. It says that bluntly. But the way Jesus talks strongly suggests, if not outright states, that the others in the group were Israelites. If you look at the end, when the man comes back, he says, "Was no one found to return to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Which means that at least the majority of the rest of the group were people of Israel. And so what we have here is not just a group of lepers, which wasn't incredibly rare, not just this group of sick guys, but guys who were so sick that it no longer mattered who was a Samaritan and who was a Jew. That these borders that were never crossed, where Jews didn't even want to be on the same road or in the same vicinity of Samaritans, they didn't want to buy their food, they didn't want to sleep in their inns. They wouldn't marry them. There was so much animosity, and yet with this group, they are so sick, they are so miserable, and they are so outcast from their respective cultures that it just didn't matter anymore. Now, I would love to say that the reason that they were able to join together was because they were just such great guys and they saw beyond the borders of their nations, but realistically, that wasn't the case. These were guys that they were so hopeless, they were so miserable that they just didn't care anymore. That there were so few people who loved them and cared about them that they were willing to spend their lives with Samaritans because they just had nowhere else to go. They had nowhere else to turn. And so we have then this mixed group of Jewish and Samaritan lepers, the rejected, the unclean. And it put them in a position, even if through bad circumstances, to be closer to the kingdom of God than the communities they left. You see, because the kingdom that Jesus was ushering in was one where it didn't matter about the mountain or the temple. And Jesus said this, he came right out and said this. When Jesus was at the well talking to the woman, he says, look, you're talking to me about the mountain and how we Jews insist that you worship in Israel. He says, look, here's the thing, a time is coming where it doesn't matter. He says, the time is coming, the kingdom that I'm bringing, the temple, the mountain, they make no difference. He says, look, it's not about the temple anymore, and it's not about the mountain. It's not where you worship. It's not about who your Father is and in what way you choose to find God. What matters is that you're worshiping in spirit and in truth, which at this point was all that these men had left. Because even if they wanted to still care if they were Samaritans or Jews, even if these guys wanted to fight with somebody else and say, hey, you can't worship at that temple or you can't worship at that mountain, they didn't have the ability to do that anyway. So the Samaritans in this group could say, look, you have to go to that mountain, and if you don't go to that mountain, you're not worshiping. But they themselves couldn't go up there. They couldn't come near the top of that mountain. And the Jews in that group, even if they wanted to say, look, if you don't go to the temple, if you don't offer sacrifices at least once a year, then your sins will not be forgiven. Well, they're out of luck too, because guess what? They can't go offer those sacrifices. They had no option but to worship in spirit and in truth. Now, I'm not saying that they did that, but their situation had pushed them in the direction that Jesus would eventually call all of their nation to do. They had released their earthly ties. They had given up on their opposing sides, and they were just lying in wait for something that they didn't even know was coming. They had this potential that Jesus saw in them to come into his kingdom and to be ready when he came to learn how to worship in a new way, because they had already severed the ties of their old religion. They had nothing to let go of. They only had the opportunity to come out of nothing and into his presence. And so Jesus comes up on this group, and they're rejected from their religions. He doesn't have to convince them not to worship at the mountain or that it's not necessary. He doesn't have to convince them that it's not all about the temple, because in their lives that just doesn't matter anymore. And so they come to him. They call out to him. And when he sees them, he says, go show yourselves to the priests. And as they went, they were cleansed. Now it seems as if it wasn't very far down the road, because the one man turns around and immediately finds Jesus. So I don't know how far down the road. Maybe it was 100 yards. Maybe it was a few miles. Maybe it was half a day's journey. But whatever the case, the man was able to come back and find Jesus easily. Now something jumped out at me about this man. I've read this story probably 1,000 times before. But as I was reading through it this week, something just stuck in my head. The lepers approach Jesus from a distance. They call out to him for mercy. He says, go and show yourselves to the priests. Now these men were lepers. They weren't allowed to worship as everybody else was allowed, but they were allowed to give offerings on behalf of their sickness. And I won't go into that whole process here. But there were stipulations in the Old Testament and on top of that, before they got to the temple, they were cleansed of their sickness. So once they got there, they were clean enough to go in. At least the Jews in the group were. you realize they left Jesus unclean. On the journey, their leprosy left them, which enabled them for the first time in possibly years to go into the temple, to show themselves to the priests, and to offer sacrifices to God as a thanksgiving for what had happened to them. But you realize that this man, the man who came back, was a Samaritan who wasn't allowed into the temple any more than he would want to go in the first place. If you suggested to a Samaritan, why don't you go into the temple to offer sacrifices, there is no way they would go in there. If you've been a Christian for years and years and years, imagine you're struggling with something in your faith, and you're working through something, and someone came up to you and said, it seems like you're struggling. Why don't you just try going into this mosque and praying there instead? Most of us in that situation would say, no way, I'm not doing that, because that's not what our religion is. And realistically, the best way to imagine the divide between Samaritans and Jews in this day is to imagine the divide between Christians and Muslims today. It's the exact same thing. And so think about all of the animosity and tensions between our two religions today. That's what was happening back here. Now, I'm not saying that we should treat Muslims the way that Jews treated Samaritans because their hearts were not in the right place. I'm not saying that we shouldn't love Muslims. But if you look at the most dogmatic, the most out of control, spiteful on either side, that is what this looked like. And so for Jesus to suggest to this Samaritan to go to the temple and lay himself before the priests would have been just as hard as if a Christian asked a Muslim to go to their church. And not just like hey, we're having a potluck, do you want some food? To genuinely worship. That's what he asks this guy to do. But here's what's amazing about this passage. The guy does it. The guy has gotten to the point where he is so detached from everything about this worldly religion that he's been a part of, that has done nothing to solve his physical problem. And he sees in Jesus the power of God, that when Jesus says to go and show yourself to the priests, this guy doesn't argue. He doesn't come up with another solution. He just goes. And it was this man who the text seems to imply was the only Samaritan in the group, who was the one who really saw what Jesus was doing in his life. You see, all 10 of those men were healed. The ones who didn't come back, they didn't just regrow their leprosy all of a sudden. They were healed. Their bodies were clean. They probably went and showed themselves to the priests and gave the sacrifices necessary and allowed themselves to be brought back into the fold of their religion. They probably returned to their families and to their friends who rejoiced to have them back. They were probably incredibly happy about the fact that they could now live as free members of society. But this man, this Samaritan, he got so much more than healed because this guy got saved. Because he allowed Jesus to not just heal his body, but to completely change the way that he viewed the world. He allowed Jesus to not just take away this sickness and this infirmity that was plaguing his skin, but he allowed God to change his heart. You see, so often we make Christianity, we make church just about fixing some problems. We, like this group of 10, come to church just to straighten some things out, to make life a little bit easier, to take away some of the pains or distractions that we have. And if this passage shows us anything, it's that even if our hearts aren't in the right place, he's still going to do it. And if you come to church every Sunday, or every other Sunday, if you spend some time in prayer, if you believe in him, he's going to bring about good things in your life. But those 9, they missed out on so much more than what they received. You see, they got a really good thing. What happened to them was amazing. It was a miracle. It completely changed and saved their lives on earth. Their lives on earth got significantly, exponentially better when Jesus healed them. But really, they just got back to where they were before they got sick. Now, leprosy is a terrible disease. It kills people. It's horrible. It's awful. But all they did was get back to where they were before. That they were living this life. It was, I don't know, probably decent. But it was right here. It was a normal life. And then they got leprosy, which brought them down. They couldn't worship. They couldn't have relationships and build friends other than with other lepers, most of which didn't last that long. And just Jesus healed them, and he brought them back up to where they were before. But this one guy, he allowed Jesus to take him a step above, you realize. He allowed Jesus to do something in his life that was greater than anything that had happened before. It wasn't for him, it wasn't just about getting back to where he was. It wasn't just about, hey, Jesus, make a way that I can live a decent human life, or I can have the same opportunities as everybody else. This one guy allowed God to radically change his heart. And we don't know what happened to him. I wish we did. But he left with faith in Jesus, in addition to his healed body. And so, church, are we following him? Are we allowing ourselves to first of all, look at our lives, to look at the brokenness that we live in? Leprosy is such a good illustration for sin, because it just covers. It eats away, it destroys, it disfigures. It takes things that were clean and that functioned and just, it rots them away until there's nothing left. And that's what sin does in our lives. And has our awareness of that just brought us to the point where it's not about what we do or how we do it, where we're ready to accept something different? And when that something different comes, when God comes into our lives, are we trying to just be okay? Are we coming to God and saying, well, you know, God, a couple years ago, my wife and I, we almost lost it, and we were thinking about divorce, and God, you pieced our marriage back together, and now we're back to fighting twice a week. We were fighting 7 days a week. I've still got bumps and bruises and scars. We were fighting every day. We were getting ready to call lawyers. And now it's just twice a week. Now we're back to just being pretty agitated with each other all the time. See, that's the 9. That's, well, God, can you come into my life enough to just get me back to where I want to be, to get me to the average, to the normal, to the good enough? You see, God doesn't want just good enough. And those 9 left just like any other person, aware of the healing, aware of the miracle, but there was nothing that elevated them over the typical human experience. But the one guy, he left so much better. And so what are we going to be, church? Are we going to be the 90% that allow God to work in our life? That we say, hey, Jesus is working with me. He's working on my anger problem. I've got my anger under control. We'll just use this as an example for a minute. So often we as Christians, if we look at a problem like anger, say, Jesus, help me get it under control. And sometimes I lose it and I scream at my kids or I scream at my wife or I scream at my friends. Maybe you scream at yourself because maybe you're the person you hate more than anybody else. You say, God, just help me get it under control. And sometimes I'll get a little mad and I'll grit my teeth and we'll get through it and you'll work in me and I won't lose my mind. You see, that's the perspective of the 9. The perspective of the 9 is, God, help me get my anger under control. But God wants to take that and swing it all the way to the other direction. You see, when God encounters a person with an anger problem, when God encounters a person who is just so out of control and they're disgust with other people or with themselves, that they just lose it over and over and over. His goal isn't to bring that person to a place where their anger is under control. That's the 9. God's plan for that person is to bring that back to the point where they swing so far the other direction that it's not just their anger is under control. It's not even that their anger is gone. He wants that person to be in a place where their love and their compassion is now out of control in their life. That person that before just was so unable to do anything but yell and scream and lose their temper can now do nothing else but love and care for other people continuously. It's that person that's just so obnoxious because they never get mad in traffic. It's that person that just keeps opening themselves up to other people. It's that person that just, no matter what they do wrong, they find a way to grow out of it. See, the 9 were all about getting it under control. The 1, what God really wants to do in your life is to take it so far the other direction. So what is it for you? What is your leprosy? What is it that takes the wonderful, clean, pure, forgiven person that you are and just covers your skin, that eats away at the person that God created you to be? And sometimes when we feel like we're not making progress, it's because we're thinking too small. That we're saying, God, just help me manage it. Help me get it under control. And God says, oh, no. See, I don't want to get it under control. I want to dig it out by the root. I want to throw it in the fire, and I want to plant the seed of my love in its place, so that my life can grow in its place. I want to uproot the anger. I want to uproot the despair. I want to uproot the hopelessness in your life. I want to dig down so deep that I get every single piece of it. I want to lift it out of the ground, and I want to throw it away so far that you will never find it again. And I'm going to put something new there, something that is the opposite, that is different, and that is better, and that is what I have for you. He doesn't want to prune your sin. He wants to get rid of it and bring in something new.